Hi, second grade! It's time for today's reading lesson. Today we're going to be reading chapter 7 of The Mouse and the Motorcycle. But before we do, we're going to go over some important words that you need to know in this chapter in order to understand it better. I know that you've been doing something like this with Miss Kinsella, but today we're going to do it as well. Now, you and I have been working on a character poster, going over some of the important character traits about the characters and other important information about them. We're going to continue that poster, don't you worry, but we're not going to do it today for chapter 7. Today we're going to talk about important words and vocabulary from the chapter, and then next time we read one of the chapters together, we'll continue our character poster. Okay, so the first important word we need to know from this chapter is the word shuddered. Now the word shudder means to tremble or shake with fear. That's a verb. For example, you might say that a puppy shuddered when they heard the thunder. So that means to tremble or shake with fear. All right, our next word is the word inhaled. Inhaled is another word that means to breathe or suck in. So like, that would be inhaling that you just heard me do. That's another verb because that's an action word that you can do. You can shudder and you can inhale. All right, the next word we're going to see in the chapter is the word oblivious. Oblivious, that's a tricky word, but that word means that you're not aware of something happening. For example, if you were in your bedroom at your house and something was happening in the kitchen, like maybe the smoke alarm went off or something, and you were oblivious to it happening because you weren't aware that it was going on. Hopefully that example made sense. That's an adjective because you can describe a person as being oblivious to something happening. So that word describes a noun. All right, our next word is reckless. Reckless means that you act without thinking about the consequences. Like the saying, you act before thinking and you want to think before you act, right? Reckless is another adjective because it describes a noun. You could say that a person was reckless if they drove their car through a red light. That sure wouldn't be safe. It would be reckless. Adjective. All right, 2 words left. The next word is scarcely. That's a tricky word because that second C sounds like an S. Scarcely. Now that's just another word that means barely or hardly. And that's an adverb because an adverb describes a verb. Okay, so let's say that you were having a hard time hearing somebody saying something. Instead of saying, I could hardly hear you, you could say, I could scarcely hear you. Now that adverb scarcely would describe the word hear, the verb hear. All right, last word is remorse. Remorse means deep regret or guilt for something you did wrong. You know, have you ever done something, I'm sure we all have, done something that we weren't supposed to do, and then you just feel that kind of pit in your stomach and you feel bad for doing something wrong? That feeling that you're feeling is remorse, guilt for doing something wrong, and that's a noun. That's a thing or a feeling that you can have. All right, so now that we've gone over some of the words that may have been tricky for us, or we might not have known what they meant when we got to that point in the book, now it's time to start reading. So we are at chapter 7, and that is on page 78. Now, remember that it's really important that you're not just listening to me reading the story, but that you have your copy of the book and that you're following along with the words as I read it. That helps you, kind of understand it better because you're able to actually read those words and know what they mean. All right, so we're on page 78, the vacuum cleaner. From his position under the bed, Ralph watched the tank of the vacuum cleaner being dragged in from the hall and listened to the clash and clang of the attachments as the maid connected a long metal tube to the nozzle at the end of the hose and fastened a carpet cleaning part to the end of the tube. He heard her humming to herself as she plugged in the deadly machine and began to work it back and forth across the carpet. It's nice she's so happy, thought Ralph bitterly as he watched the hungry machine devour dust and lint that lay in its path. The maid's feet and white sneakers moved across the room until, without bothering to bend down to see where she was cleaning, she shoved the attachment under the bed. It slid closer and closer to Ralph. And to be on the safe side, he pushed the motorcycle farther from the reach of the machine, but he dared not take his eyes off of the attachment for even an instant. All right, here's the first word we talked about on our poster. He shuddered, so remember that means shaking with fear, as he watched it gobble a dust mouse. But even as he shuddered, he was fascinated by the power of the motor. So he's really scared of the vacuum, but he's also kind of fascinated that it's so strong it can pick up all the dirt and fuzz under the bed. The maid began to sing. I'll give to you a paper of pins, for that's the way my love begins. The attachment fell off the end of the long tube, but the maid, whose thoughts were elsewhere, did not notice. Now Ralph could feel the machine suck in its breath, and he knew he was in danger of being inhaled. There's our next word, inhaled. Remember, that means to breathe or suck in. So the vacuum, you know how vacuums suck in stuff? You could say they inhale. So Ralph is scared that he's going to get sucked into the vacuum. Okay, we're at the page, on page 80 at the top. I'm going to start right there again. And he knew he was in danger of being inhaled along with the dust mice. Recklessly, the maid pushed the open end of the tube back and forth any old way. There was no guessing which way it would go next. Ralph had to run with the motorcycle to avoid that terrifying hole at the end of the tube. He ran to the right, he ran to the left, and still the maid pushed the tube around, unaware that the attachment had fallen off. Suddenly, the maid threw down the tube, but did not turn off the motor. The tube landed with a bump and a bounce, and before Ralph realized what was happening, the awful machine had inhaled his tail, and he felt himself being pulled by suction across the carpet. Oh no, so his fear came true. He's being sucked in by the vacuum. Help! He could not keep from squeaking, but no one heard him above the roar of the machine. He just managed to catch the rear wheel of the motorcycle as he was sucked along the carpet. He hung on with all his strength. The machine, which was strong enough to suck up a mouse, was not strong enough to suck up a mouse and a motorcycle. Ralph lay there on his stomach, hanging on for dear life and feeling his whiskers and fur swept back towards the machine. From his position on his stomach, Ralph could see the girl standing in front of the... But I'll pause right there so you can see the picture. There's Ralph getting sucked up by the end of the vacuum, and that's the vacuum attachment that had fallen off. So Ralph is clinging onto this motorcycle for literally dear life, because if he gets sucked up into the vacuum, it's not going to be a good day. All right. So he's seeing the girl standing in front of the dresser. That word's on the top of page 82. She was smiling at herself in the mirror and arranging her hair, dreaming, no doubt, of the busboy. Ralph despaired. There was no telling how long she would stand there in that silly way. With the vacuum cleaner motor making so much noise, the housekeeper was sure to think she was still busy working. Ralph felt his paws beginning to slip. He did not know how much longer he could hold out against the machine. He had to think of something, and he had to think of it fast. With every bit of strength he had left in his body, he clung to the wheels of the motorcycle with his left paw, while he moved his right paw up to the exhaust pipe. If he could just manage to pull himself along until he could get on the motorcycle. Bit by bit, hand over hand, Ralph dragged himself forward along the exhaust pipe. He knew he was making progress when he could see part of his tail once more. He reached back and yanked his tail out of the tube, only to have it sucked back in again. Ralph was far from being out of danger. I'll give you the keys to my heart, the maid sang to herself before the mirror, now pulling her hair behind her ears, now piling it on top of her head. oblivious to the desperate struggle under the bed. There's our word from the poster, oblivious. So she's just acting silly, thinking about a boy playing with her hair, and she's not aware that a mouse is getting sucked up by the vacuum. So remember, oblivious means not aware of something. That's a word we can use to describe the maid. We're in the middle of page 83 now. Once, Ralph's paw slipped from the exhaust pipe and he thought he was a goner until he caught the rear wheel in time to save himself. Slowly, he moved forward until his entire tail was free. Things were easier when he could brace his hind foot against the spokes of the rear wheel. Slowly, he rose, clinging to the machine, until he was able to grasp the hand grips and throw his leg over the seat. Ralph felt considerably safer sitting on the motorcycle and very much pleased with himself for having outwitted the vacuum cleaner. Ooh, outwitted is another good vocabulary word. Wit is another word for smarts. So he outwitted the vacuum cleaner, or outsmarted the vacuum cleaner. He was smarter than the vacuum cleaner because he got himself out of there. He was quite sure by now that the maid would never bother to look under the bed. He tried to move forward, propelling the cycle with his feet, but he found the suction from the motor behind him was too strong. This made him wonder if the motor on Keith's cycle was stronger than the pull of the machine behind him. The more Ralph thought about it, the more important it seemed to him to find out. No, I won't. Yes, I will, Ralph argued with himself. He had promised not to ride in the daytime. Yes, but Keith did not know he would have a chance to see which was stronger, the motorcycle or the vacuum cleaner. Keith would be interested, wouldn't he? Wouldn't any boy? Riding the motorcycle would not be reckless. There's our word at the bottom of page 84. Remember, reckless means to act without thinking. But Ralph is thinking here. He's thinking hard because he promised Keith that he wouldn't ride the motorcycle during the day, but also he's kind of getting sucked back by the vacuum cleaner. So he's like, I need to get out of here. Maybe the motorcycle's more powerful than the vacuum cleaner. I want to see. Keith would probably want to know too. So he's thinking about it. He's not just acting carelessly. So he's not being reckless there. We're at the bottom of page 84 now. It would be an important experiment. Motorcycle versus vacuum cleaner. Which would be the winner? Ralph had to find out. The maid turned abruptly, that means quickly, from the mirror. Her feet and sneakers moved across the floor toward the electric outlet. If she disconnected the vacuum cleaner, there would be no experiment. If Ralph was going to pit one motor against the other, he had to do it now. He would never have another chance. Poof, 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 poof. Ralph picked up his tail and started the motor. Without taking time to let it warm up, he gunned it with all the breath he could inhale. The motorcycle got off to a faster start than Ralph expected. So fast that Ralph lost control. He shot out from under the bed just as the vacuum cleaner died with a long, drawn-out groan. Suddenly, everything went white, and Ralph found himself bumping along in a strange, ghostly place, all white and made of cloth that seemed to be closing in on him from every direction. Ralph had ridden straight into a pillowcase thrown on top of a heap of laundry the maid had dropped on the floor, and the opening of the pillowcase had fallen shut behind him. Oh no. Ralph had no idea which way was out. He dismounted, got down from the motorcycle, and beat at the cloth with his fist, but everywhere he struck it was soft and yielding. He stamped his feet only to have the cloth give softly and silently beneath him. He began to wade through the pillowcase, tugging the motorcycle along behind him, while he wondered why he had thought it was so important to test the motorcycle against the vacuum cleaner. The light, filtered through unknown layers of cloth, was dim, and he sank to his knees in bed linen with every step. When he came to a seam, he knew he'd been wading in the wrong direction. "Drat!" muttered Ralph. He turned, still dragging the motorcycle, and tried to retrace his footsteps, only to find he had no idea which way he had come. There were no landmarks. The clouds of cloth were white, billowy, and yielding in all directions. Double drat! He stamped his foot, only to find himself sinking deeper into the linen. So he's really stuck in these like sheets and pillowcases. He can't find his way out. We're in the middle of page 87. From the swishing sounds he could hear outside, Ralph knew the maid must be unfolding clean sheets over the bed. He plodded on, dragging the motorcycle, without direction and with very little hope. "He promised to buy me a bunch of blue ribbons," sang the maid, "to tie up in my bonny brown hair." Down the hall, a door opened. Ralph heard a muffled "woof!" and in a moment, the click of a small dog's toenails on the bare floor at the edge of the hall carpet, followed by sniffing that was dangerously close. The little terrier began to bark. "I know you're in there," he yipped. "Stick out your tongue and waggle your fingers at me, will you? You just wait." So that's what the dog's saying to Ralph. Paws began to scrape at the sheets and pillowcases as if the dog were trying to dig a hole. Ralph decided it was wiser not to talk back to the dog. He huddled, scarcely breathing, against the motorcycle. There's our word from earlier, scarcely. Remember, that means hardly. So it says he's scarcely breathing. It's describing that verb there. He's hardly breathing. "Well, hello, you cute little thing," said the maid, revealing to Ralph that she was even sillier than he had thought. As if there was anything cute about a terrier that could scarcely see through his own hair. The dog went on yapping, a bit self-consciously, Ralph thought, now that he knew he was being admired by the maid. A man's steps came thumping down the hall. "Stop your racket, you pesky mutt," said the owner's voice. Racket means noise. And Ralph knew when the bark suddenly came from above him that the dog had been snatched up. "Let me down and I'll dig him out," yapped the dog as he was carried away. "Just let me down for 1 minute and I'll show you." Suddenly Ralph felt himself being tumbled about in the pillowcase. He did not even have to think what to do. He automatically grabbed for the motorcycle and held on with all his strength. Even though he had been tipped upside down with his feet in the air, Ralph knew he was being lifted up inside the bundle of bed linen and carried down the hall. He lay still, his front paws locked around the front wheel of the motorcycle, waiting to see what would happen next. The maid walked a short distance to what Ralph judged to be the linen room, and there she dumped her armload of bedding before she went off to clean another room. Ralph was deep in the hamper where no light filtered through at all. These sheets and pillowcases were on their way to the laundry, and since he had no wish to be laundered, any more than he had wished to be thrown out with the trash, there was only one thing for him to do. I'm going to pause right there. I'm at the top of page 91. Now, if Ralph got laundered or washed in the laundry, that means he'd go into the washing machine. And if a mouse went into a bunch of water, he wouldn't be able to breathe. He'd probably drown in there. So he cannot go in there. All right, I'm starting to read again at the top of 91. Start chewing. So that's what Ralph's going to do. Chew. Ralph ripped into the pillowcase with his sharp teeth, and in no time he'd made a ragged hole which he crawled through. When he tried to pull the motorcycle after him, he discovered the hole was too small. He had to stop and chew it bigger before he could pull the machine along with him. Ralph chewed through another layer of cloth and then another as he worked his way upward, each time enlarging the hole for the motorcycle. But his jaws began to ache, and still another layer of cloth lay ahead, this time a damp bath towel, which would make slow chewing. Ralph was forced to make a decision. Did he want to save his life? Or did he want to be carried off to the laundry with the motorcycle? There was only one answer. He wanted to save his life. He must abandon the motorcycle. With aching jaws, Ralph chewed onward and upward, moving faster now that he was making mouse-sized holes instead of motorcycle-sized holes. The bath towel had left an unpleasant furry taste in his mouth. Gradually, light began to filter through the cloth until finally, when Ralph thought he could not force his jaws to close on one more mouthful of fiber, he emerged into daylight at the top of the hamper. "Phew!" Ralph gasped. rubbing his aching jaws and wading across the sheets to the edge of the hamper. He leaped lightly to the floor and, hugging the baseboard, scurried down the hall to room 215, where he flattened himself and squeezed under the door. Safe but exhausted and filled with remorse at the loss of Keith's motorcycle, Ralph dragged himself off to the mouse hole to catch up on the sleep he should have had that day. Alright, so at the end of page 92, that is where chapter 7 stops. Now I'm going to reread that last sentence there. It said that Ralph was safe but exhausted and filled with remorse at the loss of Keith's motorcycle. Remember, we talked about that word remorse and what it means? It means that guilty, bad feeling that you have when you do something wrong. Why do you think that Ralph is feeling remorseful or guilty right now? Why don't you pause the video and think about it for a minute? Go ahead and pause it right now. Alright, so hopefully you thought about why you think Ralph is feeling remorseful. He's feeling really guilty, right? I'm going to give you a hint because you're actually going to be writing about why you think Ralph feels guilty or remorseful in your worksheets that you're going to be working on after this video. So, well, I know that Ralph had made a promise to Keith, right? And did he keep that promise? I don't think so. Think about what promise he made to Keith. And also, something else that happened, he lost Keith's motorcycle. How do you think Keith is going to feel about that? Because Ralph promised him that he'd keep it safe, right? So what you're going to do now is you're going to get your 2 worksheets for chapter 7 and you're going to start working on them. It's going to ask you some different questions, and it's also going to have you think about why Ralph was feeling remorseful. And then you're going to pretend that you are Ralph and write a letter to Keith. So if you were the one that had lost Keith's motorcycle, what would you say to him to make him feel better, or to make him understand why you did it, why you broke your promise? All right, boys and girls, have a good rest of your day. Please move on to those worksheets, and you'll be reading chapter 8 with Miss Kinsella tomorrow. Bye.